Death terrifies the human mind because it appears to be absolute. A wall, a disappearance, a silent ending where everything you call you is erased forever. Nearly every fear hiding beneath human behavior connects back to that single idea. The fear of aging, the fear of failure, the fear of losing time, the fear of being forgotten. People spend their entire lives running from death without ever stopping long enough to question whether they actually understand it. That is the disturbing part. Most people fear something they never deeply examined. They inherited an assumption and built their entire emotional reality around it. But modern physics shattered many assumptions humanity once treated as unquestionable truths. And one of the biggest casualties was the ordinary understanding of time itself. You were taught to imagine time as a straight road moving forward second by second, carrying your life toward a final ending. Past behind you, future ahead of you. Simple, clean, predictable. But relativity destroyed that comfortable picture. According to Einstein's understanding of space-time, the division between past, present, and future is not as fixed as your instincts want to believe. The moment you truly understand that, your entire view of death begins to crack. Because death only feels absolute if time itself is absolute, and physics no longer supports that certainty. Your mind experiences life like a moving spotlight, illuminating one instant after another, creating the illusion that moments vanish once they pass. But the universe may not work according to your psychological experience. The past may still exist as part of reality itself. Every moment of your life may still occupy its place in space-time, permanent and unreachable rather than destroyed. That possibility changes everything. Suddenly, death stops looking like annihilation and starts looking like a limitation of perspective. And that realization should shake your mind more than death itself ever did. Human beings trust their perception of time because it feels undeniable. Seconds appear to pass at the same speed for everyone. The future seems distant until it suddenly becomes the present, then immediately collapses into memory. This rhythm feels so natural that almost nobody questions it. But relativity exposed a truth that completely destabilized that confidence. Time does not flow equally everywhere. It is not a universal ticking machine controlling the cosmos with perfect consistency. It bends under gravity, it stretches with motion. Two observers moving differently through space can experience time differently and still both be correct according to the laws of physics. That is not philosophy. That is measured scientific reality. The deeper implication is far more unsettling than most people realize. If time changes depending on position, speed, and gravity, then the idea of a single universal now collapses completely. What you call the present moment is not shared equally across the universe. Somewhere, according to another frame of reference, events you consider future may already exist, while moments you think are gone may still remain part of reality. Your brain resists this because the human mind craves order and simplicity. It wants a clean timeline with a beginning, middle, and ending. But the universe does not seem interested in protecting your emotional preferences. This is where the fear of death begins to weaken under serious examination. Death depends psychologically on the belief that time carries existence forward like a conveyor belt until consciousness suddenly falls off the edge into nothingness. But relativity suggests reality is not structured like that at all. The universe may resemble a complete structure where moments exist together rather than being continuously created and destroyed. Your experience moves through those moments, but movement does not necessarily mean erasure. That distinction changes the entire conversation. The fear that everything simply disappears may say more about the limitations of human perception than about the structure of existence itself. And once that idea enters the mind, it becomes impossible to look at life and death in the same way again. Most people move through life without ever questioning the structure of reality because distraction has become a permanent lifestyle. Attention is consumed by routines, obligations, entertainment, and endless noise. Wake up, repeat the same habits, chase temporary goals, sleep exhausted, then start again. There is barely enough silence left for deeper thought, and that constant distraction creates a dangerous illusion of understanding. People assume they know what time is simply because they experience it every day. But experience is not proof of comprehension. Human history is filled with examples where instincts were completely wrong about reality. The Earth felt motionless while it traveled through space at enormous speed. Matter appeared solid while atoms were mostly empty space. Time itself seemed fixed until relativity shattered that certainty forever. One of the most disturbing ideas born from relativity is the possibility that all moments exist together inside a four-dimensional structure, often described as the block universe. In this view, the universe is not creating reality moment by moment like pages printing from a machine. Instead, every event already occupies its place in space-time. Your birth, your present thoughts, your future experiences, every conversation, every failure, every triumph, all woven permanently into the fabric of existence. The reason life feels sequential is because your consciousness experiences these moments one at a time, like a flashlight moving across an enormous landscape. But the darkness outside the beam does not cease to exist simply because you cannot currently see it. That realization forces an uncomfortable question directly into your mind. If the past still exists structurally within space-time, then what exactly does it mean for something to be gone? Human beings equate invisibility with non-existence because consciousness is trapped inside limited perception. Once a moment leaves awareness, the brain assumes it has vanished completely. But physics does not clearly support that emotional conclusion. The version of you from childhood may still exist within the architecture of space-time as permanently as the present version, reading these words. And if moments are preserved rather than destroyed, then death may not represent annihilation in the simplistic way human fear has always imagined it. The human brain constantly confuses familiarity with truth. If something feels obvious, it is accepted without resistance. That instinct helped early humans survive immediate dangers. But it also created deep limitations in understanding reality. Your senses were never designed to reveal the universe as it truly is. They were designed to keep you alive long enough to react, reproduce, and avoid threats. That means perception is practical, not absolute. The sky appears to rotate around the Earth even though the Earth itself is spinning through space. Solid objects feel stable even though they are built from particles vibrating inside mostly empty space. Time feels steady and universal even though relativity proved it changes depending on gravity and motion. Human intuition has been wrong before, and physics keeps exposing how incomplete ordinary perception really is. This becomes extremely important when thinking about death. The fear of death feels undeniable, because consciousness cannot imagine its own absence. The brain interprets that inability as proof that death must equal total annihilation. But inability to imagine something is not evidence that reality works that way. A blind person cannot perceive color, yet color still exists. Limited perception does not define the boundaries of existence itself. That is one of the hardest truths for the human ego to accept. People unconsciously believe reality should make emotional sense to them. They expect the universe to fit neatly inside the boundaries of human understanding. But the universe has never obeyed those expectations. Modern physics repeatedly reveals a reality stranger than instinct can comfortably tolerate. Space bends, time slows. Quantum particles behave in ways that seem to violate ordinary logic. Even the distinction between past and future becomes unstable under deeper examination. Yet people still cling desperately to simple ideas about existence because uncertainty feels threatening. The mind wants closure, it wants guarantees, it wants a clean explanation for life and death. But reality may not owe humanity that comfort. And once that possibility is accepted, something powerful happens. Fear begins losing its authority. Not because every mystery is solved, but because certainty itself is exposed as an illusion. Death stops appearing like a clearly defined ending and starts looking like a question far more complex than human instincts were ever prepared to answer. One of the most unsettling consequences of relativity is the collapse of the ordinary distinction between past, present, and future. Human beings experience time as if moments are continuously born and destroyed, appearing briefly before vanishing forever into memory. That perception feels so convincing that it becomes the foundation for nearly every emotional reaction to life and death. Regret depends on believing the past is gone. Anxiety depends on believing the future does not yet exist. Fear of death depends on believing consciousness is moving toward a final point where existence simply ends. But Einstein challenged that entire framework with a statement that still disturbs scientists and philosophers alike. The separation between past, present, and future may be nothing more than a stubbornly persistent illusion. That idea is far more devastating than most people initially realize. If every moment continues to exist within space-time, then life is not evaporating second by second the way human awareness assumes. Your childhood may still exist. Every word you ever spoke may still occupy its position in the structure of reality. Every person you lost may still remain woven into space-time itself rather than erased into absolute nothingness. The emotional shock comes from understanding how deeply human consciousness mistakes limited perspective for objective truth. Your awareness moves through time sequentially, so the brain interprets movement as destruction. But movement does not necessarily mean disappearance. A traveler leaving one city does not erase the city behind them. The location still exists even when it is no longer visible from their current position. This realization exposes another painful truth about human life. People waste enormous amounts of time fearing endings instead of understanding existence. Entire lives are consumed by panic over aging, status, achievement, and imagined deadlines. Days are poisoned by anxiety because the mind constantly measures life against a countdown toward death. Meanwhile, reality itself may be vastly stranger and more permanent than those fears assume. The tragedy is not simply mortality. The deeper tragedy is spending precious awareness trapped inside unquestioned assumptions, never realizing that existence may be far more profound than the frightened human mind was conditioned to believe. Most human beings are not truly afraid of death itself. They are afraid of reaching the end of life and realizing they never actually lived with awareness. That fear hides beneath almost every distraction modern life offers. Endless entertainment, constant scrolling, obsessive busyness, and the endless chase for approval all serve the same purpose: avoiding confrontation with existence. Silence becomes unbearable because silence removes the noise protecting the mind from uncomfortable truths. The moment external distraction disappears, deeper questions begin rising to the surface. Questions about meaning, questions about wasted time, questions about whether life has been lived intentionally or mechanically. And most people spend years avoiding those questions because they sense how brutal the answers might be. Relativity adds another layer to this confrontation by exposing how fragile human experience of time really is. People casually assume there will always be more opportunities later, another year to change habits, another decade to pursue purpose, another chance to repair relationships or become the person they imagine themselves capable of being. But human awareness experiences time in a narrow and temporary way. Your perception moves through moments that never pause for hesitation. Even if space-time preserves every event structurally, your conscious experience remains limited. That limitation gives urgency to existence, not because reality is meaningless, but because awareness itself is precious and temporary from your perspective inside time. This creates one of the harshest realizations about human behavior. Many people are already psychologically absent long before physical death arrives. They move through routines without attention, trapped in repetitive cycles of distraction and emotional numbness. Days blur together, years disappear unnoticed. Life becomes automatic instead of conscious. Then suddenly time feels stolen, when in reality it was surrendered voluntarily through unconscious living. Death becomes terrifying partly because it exposes that loss with brutal clarity. It forces confrontation with every postponed dream, every avoided truth, every year wasted pretending there would always be more time later. That is why understanding mortality deeply can become transformative. Not because it removes fear completely, but because it destroys the illusion that life can safely be delayed forever. Human beings are addicted to certainty because certainty creates emotional comfort. The mind wants fixed answers, stable meanings, and predictable rules that make existence feel controllable. That desire explains why people cling so aggressively to simple explanations about life and death, even when science repeatedly demonstrates that reality is far stranger than instinct suggests. The problem is not curiosity. The problem is psychological dependence on certainty itself. Most people would rather accept an incomplete answer than tolerate the discomfort of mystery. They prefer familiar illusions over difficult possibilities because uncertainty threatens the ego's sense of control. But modern physics has systematically dismantled many of humanity's most comfortable assumptions, and it continues delivering the same brutal message again and again. Reality does not operate according to human intuition. Relativity shattered the belief in universal time. Quantum mechanics shattered the belief in predictable certainty at the smallest scales of existence. Space and time themselves became flexible rather than absolute. Particles behave like probabilities until observed. Gravity bends the geometry of space-time. The deeper science investigates reality, the less the universe resembles the simple mechanical picture human beings once trusted. That should force intellectual humility, yet many people resist it because humility requires admitting how limited human understanding actually is. The universe is not obligated to fit neatly into categories that feel emotionally satisfying to the human brain. This realization has enormous consequences for the way death is understood. The possibility that human perception is incomplete means ordinary assumptions about existence may also be incomplete. Death feels absolute because consciousness cannot imagine functioning outside its current framework of awareness. But science has already revealed that many aspects of reality exist far beyond direct human perception. Radio waves existed before humans discovered them. Galaxies existed before telescopes revealed them. Quantum behavior existed long before mathematics described it. Reality does not begin where human awareness begins, and that possibility changes the emotional meaning of mortality itself. Instead of blindly fearing the unknown, the mind becomes capable of approaching existence with deeper curiosity and seriousness. The mystery of death stops being a simple wall of terror and becomes part of a much larger confrontation with the limits of human understanding. One of the strangest truths about existence is that change is happening so constantly that the idea of a permanent, unchanging self may be far more fragile than people realize. Human beings speak about identity as if it were solid and continuous, yet nearly every aspect of a person transforms over time. Cells die and regenerate, memories fade or become distorted, beliefs shift through experience, desires evolve, fears appear and disappear. The person who existed 10 years ago is psychologically different from the person existing now, even if the mind creates a narrative of continuity to maintain stability. That narrative is useful, but usefulness does not necessarily make it absolute truth. The brain constructs a sense of self partly to organize experience. Yet modern science and philosophy increasingly suggest that identity may be more fluid than instinct wants to believe. This realization changes the way death itself is viewed. People often imagine death as a single catastrophic event completely separate from life, but smaller forms of disappearance and transformation are already woven into ordinary existence. Old versions of the self vanish constantly. Entire chapters of identity dissolve over time without dramatic awareness. Childhood disappears into adulthood. Past emotional worlds become inaccessible. Earlier fears, ambitions, and personalities fade into memory. Yet despite these continuous transformations, consciousness adapts so gradually that the process feels natural rather than terrifying. The human mind accepts change when it unfolds slowly enough, even when those changes fundamentally alter identity itself. Nature reflects this same principle everywhere. Stars collapse and explode, creating the heavier elements necessary for life. Cells die continuously so living organisms can survive. Forests burn and regenerate. Galaxies evolve across billions of years. Transformation is not an exception within the universe. It is the mechanism through which existence operates. Yet human beings resist this reality emotionally because attachment creates the illusion that permanence should exist somewhere inside an impermanent system. That resistance becomes the source of enormous suffering. The more desperately the mind tries to freeze reality into fixed forms, the more terrifying change appears. But existence has never promised permanence. It only offers participation in a process far larger and more dynamic than individual fear is prepared to accept. Understanding mortality at a deeper level does not lead to passivity. It exposes how urgently life is being misused. Most people behave as if time is an unlimited resource that can be negotiated with later. They delay decisions, postpone change, and rationalize stagnation with the assumption that future versions of themselves will eventually handle everything. That assumption is one of the most damaging psychological habits human beings carry. It creates the illusion of infinite opportunity while reality continues moving forward without pause or permission. Relativity does not comfort this illusion. It reinforces the uncomfortable fact that time is not experienced evenly, not guaranteed, and not controlled by intention. Each moment becomes part of a structure that cannot be revisited in the same way once it passes through awareness. This creates a confrontation that is difficult to ignore. If life is finite from the perspective of consciousness, then every moment carries weight that is often underestimated. Not in a sentimental sense, but in a structural one. Every decision becomes part of a completed pattern that will eventually define how a life is understood as a whole. Yet people often live as if their current choices are temporary placeholders without consequence. Days are traded for distraction. Attention is fragmented into meaningless cycles. Emotional energy is spent on problems that do not matter in the long term, while meaningful opportunities are ignored because they require discomfort. This pattern continues not because people lack intelligence, but because awareness of mortality is constantly suppressed by routine and avoidance. The confrontation with death, when fully acknowledged, forces a recalibration of priorities, not through fear alone, but through clarity. It removes the illusion that time can be endlessly managed without consequence. It exposes how much of life is spent outside of conscious engagement. The realization is not meant to produce panic, but precision. It strips away unnecessary layers of distraction and forces attention back toward what is real in the present moment. Underneath all philosophical interpretation, one truth remains unavoidable. Existence is happening now, and it is being shaped continuously by how awareness is used. That recognition does not solve mortality, but it makes wasted life far harder to justify. Death has always been treated as the ultimate ending, the final boundary where everything that was once known dissolves into nothing. But when examined through the lens of modern physics, especially the implications of relativity, that certainty begins to lose its simplicity. What appears to be an absolute conclusion may instead be a limitation of perspective. The structure of space-time does not behave like a story being written moment by moment. It behaves more like a complete framework where every event already occupies its position. Within that framework, the idea of ending becomes less clear, because nothing is being actively erased in the way human intuition assumes. Instead, awareness moves through a structure that may already exist in totality. This does not remove the mystery of death, but it completely changes its emotional shape. The fear rooted in disappearance begins to weaken when the assumption of disappearance itself becomes uncertain. Human consciousness experiences life sequentially, which creates the feeling that existence is constantly being lost. But that feeling is not necessarily evidence of what reality is doing. It is evidence of how perception operates inside limited time. The universe does not appear obligated to follow the same psychological rules that govern human experience. And once that separation is recognized, the definition of death becomes far less stable than it first appears. What remains is a deeper realization. Life is not something that can be paused, controlled, or extended through expectation. It unfolds within constraints that are already in motion, whether or not moments persist in some form beyond perception. The experience of awareness is always temporary from the inside. That makes presence more significant than interpretation. Instead of treating existence as something to be endlessly analyzed for guarantees, it becomes something to be directly engaged while it is accessible. The question is no longer only what happens after life, but what is being done with the only part that can actually be experienced. In that sense, the final truth is not about answering death, but about refusing to waste the reality that is undeniably here right now.